The engine coughed once, twice, then died completely, leaving us stranded on a desolate stretch of road somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It was a place where the horizon stretched on forever, broken only by the occasional skeletal tree or rusting fence post. No houses, no cars, no sign of life, just the empty monotony of rural nowhere, the kind of landscape that swallows you whole. I sat behind the wheel, gripping it tighter than necessary, trying not to let my panic show. The kids in the back seat were restless, my wife staring at the map like it might suddenly tell us something useful. The farmer appeared out of the haze like some relic of an earlier century, his truck rumbling to a stop behind us. He looked the part too, overalls faded to the color of old denim, straw hat tilted back on his head, and a grin that seemed just a little too wide. Relief washed over me as he introduced himself, offered to help. He even had a tow hitch, said he could take us back to his place until we could arrange a proper repair. I didn't think twice about it. What choice did we have? Stranded out here with the sun sinking low and no phone signal, he felt like a godsend. The farmhouse was exactly what you'd expect, right down to the peeling white paint and the sagging porch. It might have been charming, under different circumstances. The barn loomed behind it, a massive, shadowy thing that seemed to hum with its own presence. The farmer's wife met us at the door, wiping her hands on her apron, her smile just as broad as her husband's. She led us inside, where the air smelled faintly of old wood and something metallic underneath. They made us dinner, cornbread, stew, iced tea, so sweet it made your teeth ache. I should have felt grateful, should have let the warmth of their hospitality ease the tension knotting my shoulders. Instead, I felt like a mouse wandering into a trap, the bait too perfectly placed. There was something off about them, something I couldn't quite pin down. Their cheerfulness seemed rehearsed, their laughter too loud, too sudden. The kids noticed it first, the way kids always do, though they couldn't articulate it. My youngest, barely 5, kept glancing at the farmer's wife with wide eyes, like he'd seen something he couldn't understand. My older son stayed unusually quiet, pushing his food around his plate without eating much. My wife caught my eye across the table, her expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in her jaw. She felt it too, though neither of us said anything. Not yet. As the evening wore on, the farmer's jovial facade began to slip. Little things at first, the way he spoke about the land, about the outsiders who didn't understand what it meant to live out here. There was a bitterness to his words, a kind of simmering resentment that made my skin crawl. His wife would hush him, smiling apologetically, but her eyes betrayed something darker. When they showed us to the guest room, it was just as rustic as the rest of the house. The bed creaked when you sat on it, the quilt smelled faintly of mothballs, and the single window looked out onto the barn, its doors slightly ajar. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from that dark gap, though I told myself it was just my imagination. We tried to settle in, but sleep didn't come easily. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the floorboards making my heart race. At some point, I realized I hadn't heard the kids for a while. The silence was deafening, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I got up to check on them. Their room was empty. I found them downstairs in the living room, standing perfectly still, their faces pale. The farmer and his wife were there too, along with another man I hadn't seen before. He was hulking, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He didn't speak, just stared at me with cold, unblinking eyes. The kids didn't look scared exactly, but there was something unnatural in the way they stood, as if they were frozen in place. The farmer smiled at me, his teeth too white, too even. Something snapped in me then. I grabbed the kids and bolted for the door, my wife right behind me. We didn't make it far. The hulking man moved faster than seemed possible, blocking our way with a raised hand. His fingers were thick, gnarled, the nails dark with something I didn't want to think about. The farmer's wife stepped forward, her smile gone now, replaced with something cold and calculating. They didn't say a word, just herded us back upstairs like livestock. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself was closing in around us. When they locked us in the guest room, I heard the bolts slide home, a sound that sent ice down my spine. That's when the screaming started, not ours, but from somewhere outside near the barn, high-pitched inhuman wails that made my stomach churn. The kids buried their faces in my wife's lap, trembling. I pressed my ear to the door, but all I could hear was the faint hum of machinery beneath the screams. By morning, the house was silent again, the barn doors shut tight. The farmer greeted us with his usual grin, as if nothing had happened. He said the mechanic would be there soon to look at the car, but I knew better, and we weren't leaving, not unless we found a way to escape. The question wasn't if they would kill us, but when. The room was small but clean, with just enough charm to justify the rent. The ad had promised peaceful suburban living, and the landlord, Mr. Horner, had seemed harmless enough when I met him. A wiry man in his 60s with watery eyes and a penchant for small talk, he radiated the kind of quiet loneliness that made me feel sorry for him. I figured a widow, maybe divorced. There was a sadness in the way he held himself, a reluctance to look directly at you for too long. The house itself was immaculate, though it had the faint cloying smell of disinfectant. The walls were painted pale yellow, the kind of color you'd expect in a cheerful place, but the light never seemed to hit them quite right. Shadows clung to the corners of the house like cobwebs, and the air always felt a little too still, like the house was holding its breath. The rules came later, not when I signed the lease or when I moved in, but a week or so after I'd unpacked my boxes and settled in. They were delivered casually, like afterthoughts. The trash must be taken out before dark. The basement door must stay closed and locked at all times. I nodded along, not thinking much of it. Every landlord has their quirks, and the rent was cheap enough that I could put up with just about anything. But over the weeks, the rules started to feel more like a set of warnings. The trash rule was the first to bother me. If I forgot and let it sit overnight, I'd find it the next morning tipped over, its contents scattered across the driveway. At first, I assumed it was raccoons, but the mess was always oddly precise, like someone had sorted through it looking for something. Bits of paper and food wrappers laid out in neat little piles. The basement door was worse. It was a plain wooden door at the end of the hallway with a heavy lock bolted into the frame. Sometimes at night I thought I could hear faint noises coming from behind it, a soft shuffling, the creak of floorboards, the faintest murmur of a voice. I convinced myself it was nothing. Old houses make noises, I told myself. Pipes groan, floorboards settle, but the more I ignored it, the more insistent it became. One night I couldn't take it anymore. It was past midnight, and the house was silent, except for that faint, rhythmic sound like someone pacing back and forth behind the door. I stood in the hallway, staring at the lock, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself I was imagining things, that I'd jiggle the knob and it would be stuck, and that would be the end of it. The knob turned easily in my hand. The smell hit me first, thick and rancid, like spoiled meat left out in the sun. I gagged, my stomach lurching, but I pushed the door open anyway. The stairs descended into darkness, the air growing colder with each step. There was something down there. It wasn't a person, at least not anymore. The figure sat hunched in the corner, its limbs too long, its body twisted and wrong. Its skin was pale and mottled, stretched too tightly over its bones, and its head jerked toward me with a sharp, unnatural movement when the light from the hallway spilled into the room. Its face, God, its face was a mess of scars and sunken features, its mouth stretched into a grin far too wide, showing teeth that were jagged and uneven. It laughed. Not a human laugh, but something high-pitched and stuttering, like a recording played at the wrong speed. The sound clawed at my ears, and I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the top step. The door slammed shut before I could scream. I spent the rest of the night locked in my room, my back pressed against the door, listening to the sounds of movement below, footsteps on the stairs, soft knocks against my walls, and once, just once, the sound of breathing on the other side of the door. When morning came, I tried to leave. My suitcase was packed, my keys in hand, but the front door wouldn't budge. The lock twisted and turned, but it was like the door was welded shut. I was trapped. Mr. Horner found me hours later, sitting on the floor in front of the door, my hands scraped raw from clawing at the wood. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with those watery eyes, his face calm and expressionless. "You shouldn't have opened the basement," he finally said. That was when I heard it. The sound of heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, slow and deliberate. And then laughter. We hadn't meant to find the cabin, let alone go inside, but the weather turned suddenly that afternoon, sharp winds and black clouds rolling in like a bad omen, and we were desperate for shelter. The forest had been endless, trees closing in tight on all sides, and then there it was, a sagging structure with a rusted tin roof, sitting in a clearing like a mouth full of broken teeth. Something about it felt wrong from the start. The windows were covered with grime, their glass spider-webbed with cracks. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying in the wind, and I remember thinking it looked like it was waiting for us. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the faint stench of mildew and something sour, like spoiled meat. The place was nearly empty, save for a few overturned chairs and a rotting wooden table in the centre. But there were signs, subtle at first, that we weren't the first to stumble across it. A fire pit in the corner filled with fresh ash, a pile of leaves and old blankets arranged into a crude bed, a tin cup resting on the edge of the table with the unmistakable sheen of condensation on its rim. Someone had been here recently. The others, Mark, Ellie and Doug, joked about it, calling it the horror movie cabin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't have stayed. The storm made the decision for us. By the time the rain came down in sheets, it was too late to keep moving. We unrolled our sleeping bags in the main room, ignoring the faint smell of damp wood and the creaks of the building as it shifted uneasily around us. It wasn't until the sun set that we realized how deep the silence went. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves in the wind were gone. The only noise was the occasional drip of rainwater through the cracks in the ceiling, hitting the floor in slow, deliberate beats. Then Ellie found the marks. Carved into the wood of the table were deep grooves, as though someone had dragged a knife across its surface over and over again. The patterns weren't random. They crisscrossed in deliberate intersecting lines that looked almost like a map, but it wasn't the table that made us uneasy. It was the walls. At some point, someone had scratched symbols into nearly every wooden plank, chaotic and jagged, overlapping in a way that made my eyes feel strained. They didn't look like letters, but they weren't meaningless either. Something about them felt alive, as though they were waiting for someone to understand them. By the time we realized what we were surrounded by, it was dark, and that's when the noises started. The first was a faint crack, like a twig snapping underfoot, carried to us on the wind, then another, closer this time. A sound that might have been the scrape of something metallic dragged across bark. I saw Mark glance towards the windows, his face pale in the moonlight. None of us wanted to admit what we were thinking. We weren't alone out here. Around midnight, the fire in the corner guttered out and we were plunged into cold darkness. I lay awake, staring at the beams of the ceiling, every nerve in my body strung tight. That's when I saw it, a faint glimmer of light through the window. Far off in the trees it was moving, bobbing rhythmically like a lantern swaying in someone's hand. It vanished behind the trees, only to reappear seconds later, closer this time. Doug was the first to say what we all feared. The light wasn't random, it was circling us. The rest of the night passed in a blur of shallow breathing and strained silence. The light would vanish for long stretches, only to reappear at different points around the cabin. Sometimes it seemed impossibly close, but there was never any sound, just the feeling of being watched. When the sun rose, we stumbled outside, desperate to leave the place behind. That's when we found the marks. They were carved into the trees around the clearing, the same jagged patterns from inside the cabin. They hadn't been there the day before. The forest felt different as we hurried through it, the air heavier, the shadows deeper. Every so often, I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A flash of something pale slipping between the trees, gone before I could focus on it. We didn't speak much as we walked, the silence punctuated by the occasional snap of a branch or crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time we stopped to catch our breath, I realized something chilling. The forest had no sound. No birds, no insects. Just us. And then, faintly, the sound of footsteps. They were deliberate, unhurried and far too close. We broke into a run, the trees blurring around us, the sound of pursuit growing louder with every step. I didn't look back not until we reached the edge of the forest and the sun was high overhead. When I did, I saw them, figures standing just within the shadows of the trees. Too far away to make out details, but close enough for me to know they were watching us. We never spoke about what happened, not to each other, not to anyone else. But sometimes in the quiet of the night I'll see a light through my window. A faint glow bobbing in the darkness, watching, waiting. The first time I noticed something was off, it was the plants. I'd arranged them neatly on the windowsill when I moved in, all facing the light. But one evening after work I came home to find the fern had been turned slightly, as though someone had nudged it. It was the kind of thing you tell yourself doesn't matter. A breeze maybe, a careless moment you didn't remember. I told myself that too. The apartment was on the third floor of an old building that groaned with age. The floorboards creaked unpredictably, the radiators hissed like angry cats, and there was always a faint smell of dust, like the place had never quite been aired out properly. The kind of place that made you feel like you were never quite alone, even when you were. The misplaced plant was the first, then it was my keys. I always kept them in the bowl by the door, a habit I'd had for years. One morning I found them on the kitchen counter. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself I'd left them there in a moment of forgetfulness. It had to be me, didn't it? But it wasn't just the keys. The shampoo bottle in the bathroom was moved an inch to the left. The drawer with the tea towels wasn't fully shut. A pair of shoes I hadn't worn in weeks was suddenly in the hallway. They were little things, easy to dismiss, easy to ignore, until they weren't. The smell came next. Faint at first, just a whiff of something foreign as I walked through the door. Not unpleasant exactly. It reminded me of cologne, but not mine, and certainly not anything I'd invited in. I started sleeping with the door locked, which I hadn't done before. It didn't help. Nights became oppressive, each sound magnified, every creak of the building suddenly suspicious. I told myself I was imagining it. Old buildings make noises after all. You hear a pop in the walls and your brain turns it into a threat. Except one night I woke to the sound of breathing. It was soft, rhythmic, just on the edge of perception. My heart pounded as I stared into the dark, straining to hear over the rush of blood in my ears. The breathing stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I told myself it was a bad dream. That's what you do when the alternative is too terrifying to accept. But the feeling didn't go away. It sat heavy in my chest, a constant weight, as though the walls themselves were leaning in closer. Then I found the crawl space. The building was old, like I said, and full of odd quirks. Uneven floors, strange alcoves, dead spaces in the architecture. But this wasn't on the rental listing. It was behind the closet in the bedroom, a narrow panel I hadn't noticed before. The edges were worn, and when I pried it open, the smell hit me immediately. Stale air and something faintly organic, like rotting wood or damp cloth. I wish I'd never opened it. Inside was a cramped, low-ceilinged space, barely wide enough to crawl through. The floor was covered in dust, but not untouched. There were drag marks, handprints, a makeshift nest of blankets and clothes shoved into one corner. I saw a half-empty bottle of water, a tin of biscuits, and worst of all, a notebook. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, ramblings that made no sense, lists of dates and times. My dates, my times. Tuesday, home at 7:30, watched TV until 10:15, ate soup. Saturday, went out with friends, came back drunk. Didn't check the crawl space. I dropped the notebook and stumbled back, my stomach lurching. That's when I heard it. A faint sound like shuffling coming from deeper in the crawl space. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The shuffling grew louder and I saw the blankets shift slightly. I don't remember how I got out of the apartment. I remember fumbling with the locks, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my keys. I remember the icy night air hitting my face as I bolted down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't go back. I called the police from a friend's house, my words tumbling over each other in a panicked rush. They found the crawl space empty when they arrived, but the signs were there. Blankets, food, a series of photographs taken of me through the cracks in the walls. They never found him. I moved out the next day, but the feeling has never left me. Even now, in a new flat in a new city, I still lock the door every night. I still wake up to strange creaks in the walls, and I still feel eyes on me when I'm alone. The darkness in caves is not like the darkness of the night. Night has stars, a moon, some shred of light, no matter how faint. Underground, the darkness is a living thing, thick and endless, pressing against your eyes and ears until you can almost hear it breathe. We thought we were prepared for it. Headlamps, spare batteries, emergency flares, we had it all. But you can't prepare for the way it creeps into your mind, carving out little pockets of fear that grow bigger and blacker the longer you're in it. We were 3 days into the expedition when things started to go wrong. The first day had been exhilarating. We squeezed through tight passages, marveling at the alien beauty of the rock formations, the glistening stalactites like the jaws of some ancient creature. The second day was harder. Longer climbs, narrower spaces, and a growing sense of isolation as the surface world faded further behind us. By the third day, our nerves were wearing thin, and that was before we got lost. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic moment like in the movies. There was no frantic realization, no shouted blame. It was slower, creeping up on us like the darkness itself. A turn here, a wrong tunnel there. We followed markings that didn't match our map, doubling back only to find ourselves in a place we didn't recognize. It was like the cave was shifting around us, a labyrinth with no exit. That's when we saw the first trap. It was crude but effective. A tripwire strung low across a narrow passage, barely visible in the dim glow of our headlamps. Beyond it, a pit yawned open, its jagged rocks glinting like teeth. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. This wasn't a natural hazard. Someone had put it there. We were too shaken to speak, not that words would have done much good. We kept moving, slower now, every step tentative. And that's when we found the hermit. He wasn't like anything I'd ever seen, not in real life. Thin, gaunt, with a wild beard, and eyes that glinted like polished stones in the dark. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones. He didn't move like a normal person. He skulked, his movements jerky and deliberate, like a predator. At first he stayed at a distance, watching us from the edges of our light. Then he started to follow us. We tried to lose him, taking random turns and doubling back on ourselves, but it didn't matter. The cave was his world. Every time we thought we'd shaken him, he'd reappear, always just out of reach, always watching. And the traps kept coming, more tripwires, false paths that led to sudden drops, even sharp stakes embedded in the floor. He was herding us, driving us deeper into his territory. That's when the paranoia set in. Every sound became a threat. The scrape of a boot on stone, the drip of water echoing through the tunnels, the faint rustle of unseen movement. We started to suspect each other. Who had the map last? Who'd insisted we take that turn? The cave wasn't just a physical labyrinth, it was eating away at our minds, twisting us against each other. The worst part was the silence when he wasn't there. The tension would build unbearable until one of us swore they'd seen him again. He became a phantom, always just out of sight. His traps a cruel reminder that he was never far away. We started leaving markers, scratching the walls with whatever we had, knives, rocks, even our fingernails, when we ran out of tools. But somehow he erased them, or maybe the cave did. It didn't matter, we were running in circles and the air was growing thinner. Every breath tasted of damp stone and panic. Then came the laughter, faint at first, like the echo of a memory, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human laughter, it was guttural, almost animalistic, and it followed us no matter where we went. It wasn't just him anymore, there was something else down there, something he'd either unleashed or become. One by one, we began to fall apart. Exhaustion, hunger, and the relentless pressure of the dark turned us into shadows of ourselves. Every time we closed our eyes, we saw the hermit's face, his grin wide and feral, his eyes gleaming with a cruel intelligence. And the traps, oh, the traps, they became more elaborate, more vicious, as if he was toying with us, savoring our fear. We lost one of us to a pitfall, another to a collapsing passage. It was just me by the end, scrambling blindly through the maze, my headlamp flickering and my hands bleeding from scrapes and cuts. I don't know how I made it out. Maybe he let me go, or maybe the cave spit me out like a bad memory. But I'll never forget the last thing I saw before I clawed my way to the surface. His face, pale and grinning, illuminated by the faint glow of my dying lamp. His laughter followed me all the way up, echoing through the tunnels like a curse. They never found the others. They searched the cave. But the hermit was gone, and so were my friends. The rescue team said it was the darkness, the isolation that had driven me mad. But I know the truth. The cave wasn't empty. The first thing you notice about suburbia is the quiet. It's not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful or comforting. It's the sort that crawls under your skin, hollow and expectant, like the world is holding its breath for something terrible to happen. When Sarah and I moved into 15 Sycamore Drive, we were desperate for a fresh start. After the miscarriage and the slow unraveling of our marriage that followed, the house was supposed to be a new chapter, a place where we could patch the cracks and learn to live again. But the neighborhood had other ideas. The neighbors seemed pleasant enough at first, all smiles and welcome baskets. Mrs. Hargrove, from across the street, brought us a plate of cookies that tasted like they'd been baked with sawdust. Mr. Downs next door offered to lend us his lawnmower before we'd even mentioned cutting the grass. There was a potluck invitation taped to our mailbox on the second morning. complete with a handwritten note about how they loved to see young blood moving in. I didn't like the phrasing, but Sarah thought it was charming, so we went. The potluck was held in the cul-de-sac, tables loaded with casseroles and salads, the air thick with the smell of barbecue and citronella. Everyone was so pleasant. Too pleasant. The smiles were a little too wide, the laughter a little too loud. They asked questions, lots of questions, about where we'd come from, why we'd moved here, what our plans were. It felt like an interview rather than a welcome. I chalked it up to my own nerves, the leftover tension of trying to salvage a marriage that felt like it was balancing on a knife's edge. But then there were the whispers. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Late at night, when the street was dark and the houses stood like silent sentinels, I'd hear it. Faint murmurs carried on the wind, voices speaking in low, rhythmic tones. Sarah never heard them. She slept like the dead, the stress of the move and everything else knocking her out cold each night. I told myself it was the wind, the creak of tree branches, the settling of houses, but deep down I knew better. Things escalated slowly, as they always do in stories like this. It started with small things. Our rubbish bins dragged back to the curb before we could collect them, packages left on the porch that we hadn't ordered. Once I found a jar of what looked like animal fat sitting on our doorstep, the lid sealed with wax. Sarah thought it was some kind of weird welcoming gift, but I could feel the wrongness radiating off it like heat. I threw it away and spent the rest of the day feeling like I was being watched. The neighbours started dropping by unannounced. Mrs. Hargrove would knock on the door with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, asking if we needed anything. Mr. Downs showed up one evening with a six-pack of beer and stayed for an hour, talking about local politics and the importance of community while I nodded along, trying to ignore the way he kept glancing at Sarah's photo on the mantel. It was suffocating, their relentless friendliness, like they were trying to smother us with kindness. Then we found the symbol. It was etched into the wooden frame of our back door, a looping, intricate design that looked almost like a flower, except the petals were too sharp, too angular. It hadn't been there when we moved in. Sarah thought it was graffiti, probably left by some bored teenagers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a message, a warning. That night, the whispers grew louder, and for the first time, I could almost make out the words. Almost. I started watching the neighbours more closely after that. I'd sit by the window late at night, the curtains drawn just enough for me to see without being seen. That's when I noticed the meetings. Small groups gathering in Mr. Downes's backyard, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of candlelight. They would sit in a circle, heads bowed, and I swear, I saw them swaying in unison, like leaves caught in a breeze. It wasn't just Mr. Downes. The gatherings rotated between houses, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to pull the whole street into its orbit. I made the mistake of asking about it. The next day, Sarah found a dead bird on the porch, its wings splayed wide, its eyes gone. She thought it was the cat from 2 doors down, but I knew better. That night, the whispers came from our backyard, closer than ever, and when I went to look, the symbol had been carved into the grass, its lines perfect and unbroken, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Sarah wanted to call the police, but I stopped her. What would we say, that our overly friendly neighbours were holding secret meetings and leaving cryptic symbols on our property? That the whispers in the night weren't in our heads? No one would believe us. Hell, I barely believed it myself. It all came to a head 3 nights later. We woke to the sound of chanting, low and guttural, like a song dragged up from the depths of the earth. The symbol was everywhere, on the windows, the walls, even scrawled across the ceiling in what looked like ash. The neighbours were in the yard, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting the faint glow of the moon. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the house with an intensity that made my skin crawl. We left that night, throwing what we could into the car and driving until the sun came up. The house is still there, its blinds drawn, its garden overgrown. The neighbours haven't listed it for sale. Sarah says it's over, that we're safe now. The cabin was supposed to be an escape. A quiet weekend in the woods, just me and the hum of nature to drown out the city noise still rattling in my skull. The brochure made it sound idyllic. Secluded retreat with all the amenities you need. I wasn't looking for much, just a roof, a bed, and a bit of solitude. When I arrived, the air felt thick, the trees pressing in on all sides like they were trying to swallow the place whole. But I chalked it up to the weather. A storm was rolling in, dark clouds already heavy on the horizon. The first day passed without much incident. I took a walk, explored the narrow paths that wound through the forest, and spent the evening with a beer and a book. The wind picked up after sunset, howling through the trees like some wild animal. By the time I went to bed, the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming against the cabin's tin roof. It was a soothing sort of chaos, the kind of noise that puts you under fast and deep. It wasn't the storm that woke me, it was the rattle of the back door. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The storm had picked up even more overnight, and the entire cabin creaked like an old ship at sea. But then it came again, a sharp, deliberate sound, like someone testing the handle. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding, straining to hear over the rain. Nothing, just the storm raging outside. I told myself it was my imagination, that I had been alone all day, and there was no reason to think otherwise. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. In the morning, the world was sodden and grey, the kind of damp that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave. I went to check the back door just to be sure, and that's when I saw them. Muddy footprints leading up to the door and back again. Not boot prints, but bare feet. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe a local had wandered by, someone caught in the storm and looking for shelter, but there were no houses for miles, no trails that weren't half swallowed by the forest. And then there was the way the prints stopped abruptly at the tree line, as if whoever it was had melted back into the woods. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I thought I saw something, just a flicker of movement between the trees. Gone before I could be sure. By evening, I was on edge, my stomach knotted tight. I locked all the doors and windows before the sun went down, double-checking every latch. The storm was still raging, and the roads were completely washed out. I was stuck until the weather let up. That night, the rattling started again. This time it wasn't just the back door. It was the windows, the front door, even the shutters on the little bathroom window. The sounds came in waves, moving around the cabin like something or someone was circling it, probing for a way in. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, every muscle in my body tensed for a fight that never came. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside to look for tracks. They were everywhere, circling the cabin, leading up to the doors and windows, and always ending at the tree line. The sight made my skin crawl. Whoever was out there wasn't lost or wandering. They knew I was here, and they were playing with me. The third day was worse. I couldn't focus on anything. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind felt like a threat. I caught glimpses of the figure now, a tall, hunched shape just at the edge of my vision, always retreating before I could get a clear look. It didn't feel human, whatever it was. There was a wrongness to it, something animal and deliberate all at once. By nightfall, I was fraying. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and I knew I wouldn't survive another night like the last. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I made a barricade out of the furniture, piling chairs and the small dining table against the doors. I sat in the middle of the room with my back to the fireplace, the knife clutched in one hand, a flashlight in the other. The noises started earlier this time, not just rattling, but scratching now too, sharp and slow. Like nails dragging against wood. The figure was closer, its shadow flitting past the windows, blocking out the faint glow of the storm-choked moon. My barricade held, but the walls felt like they were closing in, and then I heard it, breathing, deep, rasping breaths just on the other side of the front door. It was too deliberate to be the wind, too close to ignore. I screamed then, not words, just raw animal noise, as if I could scare it off with sheer desperation. The breathing stopped. For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing but the sound of the storm and my own ragged breaths. And then came the laughter. It was soft at first, almost playful, but it grew louder, more guttural, filling the cabin until it drowned out everything else. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and knife and ran for the back door, tearing away the barricade with shaking hands. The storm swallowed me whole as I bolted into the woods, branches clawing at my face, the mud sucking at my feet. I don't know how long I ran, long enough that my lungs felt like they'd burst, long enough that I couldn't hear the laughter anymore. I spent the rest of the night huddled under a tree, the storm soaking me to the bone. When the sun finally rose, I found my way to the road. A ranger picked me up a few hours later, his expression grim when I told him about the cabin. "You're not the first," he said. "The cabin's still there, I imagine, waiting for the next poor soul to rent it. I don't know who or what I saw in those woods." The room was as cheap as they came, but that was exactly what I needed. Just 4 walls, a bed that squeaked if you so much as breathed too hard, and a rickety desk where I could park my ancient laptop and churn out the kind of writing I hoped would finally pay the bills. The wallpaper was yellowed and peeling, the carpet threadbare, and the radiator clanged at odd hours like a ghost, rattling its chains. It was the kind of place where hope came to die, but for me it was a sanctuary, at least at first. The boarding house was tucked away on a side street, far enough from the city centre to be quiet, but close enough to keep the illusion of opportunity alive. There were 6 rooms in total, and the other tenants were the sort you'd expect. Solitary, transient, their lives stitched together with frayed threads. I kept to myself, as did they. At least that's what I thought. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not in my room, but in the hallway. It was faint, like something rotting just out of sight. At first I chalked it up to the age of the building. Decaying wood, mildew in the walls. Old places always had a stink about them, didn't they? But it wasn't just age. It was sharper than that, something acrid that made my throat tighten whenever I breathed it in. It seemed to get stronger the closer I got to the end of the hall, near the locked door. The landlord had been clear about the door when I moved in. It belonged to one of the other tenants, a man named Fletcher. He wasn't the friendliest sort, she'd said, but he paid his rent on time and didn't cause trouble. I hadn't seen much of him, just glimpses. A hunched figure in a long coat, his face obscured by a cap pulled low. He moved like a shadow, always slipping in and out without a word. The other tenants seemed to avoid him too, their eyes darting away whenever his name came up in conversation. I started hearing things at night, faint noises that didn't belong. The usual creaks and groans of an old building were easy to ignore, but this was different. Scraping sounds like furniture being dragged across the floor, thuds that made the walls vibrate. Once I thought I heard a low moan, barely audible through the thin plaster. I told myself it was my imagination, the product of too much caffeine and not enough sleep. Writers had overactive minds, didn't they? Always turning shadows into monsters. Then the disappearances started. The first one was a girl from the coffee shop down the road. She'd served me countless lattes, always with a tired smile. One day, she just didn't show up for her shift, and her co-workers whispered about how she'd been planning to leave town. No one thought much of it. People disappeared all the time in cities like this. But then there was the man who sold flowers outside the train station, and the old woman who walked her dog past the boarding house every morning. It wasn't until I realized they'd all been regulars on my street that the unease started to settle in. The smell in the hallway grew worse. It clung to the air like a greasy film, making my stomach churn. Fletcher's door was always locked, but I started noticing little things, the way the doorknob was scratched as if someone had fumbled with a key, the dark stains on the carpet near the threshold, the faint buzzing of flies whenever I passed by. One night I saw him, really saw him. He was standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the dim light of the landing. He was holding something, a bag, heavy and misshapen, that dripped a dark liquid onto the floorboards. He didn't move, didn't even breathe, as if he knew I was watching. I stumbled back into my room, bolting the door behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't sleep that night or the one after. It wasn't long before I started looking for answers. I combed through old newspapers, police reports, anything I could find about the disappearances. The pattern was there if you looked closely enough. All of them had been seen near the boarding house in the days before they vanished. I even overheard one of the tenants, a wiry man with nicotine-stained fingers, muttering about strange sounds coming from Fletcher's room. "Like someone crying," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I knew I shouldn't, but one night I tried the door. It was unlocked. The smell hit me like a wall, almost knocking me back. The room was bare except for a single wooden chair and a large trunk in the center of the floor. My stomach turned as I approached it, my hands trembling. The latch was rusted, but it opened easily enough. Inside were scraps of clothing, torn and stained, and beneath them, God, I don't even want to think about what was beneath them. But that wasn't the worst of it. What made my blood run cold was the stack of photographs lying at the bottom. They were of me, walking to the coffee shop, sitting at my desk, sleeping in my bed. The last one was dated the night before, and in it Fletcher was standing over me, his face a blank, leering mask. I left the boarding house that night, running blindly into the cold, dark streets. I didn't stop until I was miles away, shaking and breathless, the taste of bile in my throat. The police didn't find anything when they searched Fletcher's room the next day. No trunk, no photographs, no sign of him. The landlord claimed she'd never heard of a tenant named Fletcher, that the room at the end of the hall had been vacant for months. Sometimes I still smell it, that acrid, rotting stench. I moved far away, but it doesn't matter. Wherever I go, I can still feel him watching. The car smelled like stale coffee and cheap air freshener, the kind that tried too hard to mask something worse. I sank into the cracked leather seat, still half buzzed from too many cocktails and the thudding bass of the club. The world outside was a blur of neon signs and streetlights, the edges soft and shimmering like the night itself had been dipped in liquor. I just wanted to get home. That's what I kept telling myself. Just a quick ride and I'd be in my bed, the city and its chaos tucked away behind a locked door. The driver didn't say much, which suited me fine. He had one of those faces that were easy to forget. Average in every way, a bland amalgamation of features that didn't seem to belong to anyone in particular. His name was on the app, but I didn't pay attention. Why would I? It was late and my head was swimming. All I cared about was the little map on my phone, the route snaking its way back to my flat. The first detour seemed harmless enough. Roadworks, maybe. A turn down a side street that wasn't marked on the map. I glanced up from my phone, frowning at the dimly lit road. The buildings here were squat and dark, their windows boarded or shattered. I didn't remember seeing this part of town before, but then again I wasn't exactly in my right mind. My grip on the strap of my purse tightened as I cleared my throat, half expecting him to say something like, "Don't worry, just a shortcut." He didn't. He just kept driving, his hand steady on the wheel. The second turn wasn't on the map either. I started to notice things then. The way the speedometer danced just above the limit, the way his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror too often, like he was checking on me. The streets grew narrower, the streetlights fewer and farther between. I checked my phone again, but the little blue dot on the map was moving in the wrong direction, away from home. My chest tightened, the remnants of my buzz evaporating as cold reality set in. I asked myself what the hell I'd been thinking. Ordering a ride alone at this hour, half drunk, my wits dulled. It was so easy, so convenient. A tap on a screen and some stranger pulled up to whisk you away, but now, sitting in that car, I felt the stupidity of it like a stone in my gut. We were in the middle of nowhere. The city had disappeared, replaced by endless stretches of cracked asphalt and shadowy trees. My stomach churned as I realized I had no idea where we were, and the driver wasn't following the app's directions anymore. I clutched my phone tighter, but there was no signal, not even a flicker of a bar. The driver hummed softly under his breath, something tuneless and low. It was almost worse than silence. There was a calmness to him, an eerie patience that made my skin crawl. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't making excuses or fumbling for an explanation. He was in control, and I was at his mercy. The road curved, and the headlights swept over a wooden sign that flashed by too quickly to read. Gravel crunched under the tires as we left the pavement behind, the car bumping along a dirt path that wound deeper into the trees. My pulse pounded in my ears as I tried to think, tried to focus. What did he want? Where was he taking me? The possibilities ran through my head like a sick, twisted slideshow, each image worse than the last. The car slowed, the engine rumbling low and steady. I knew this was it. Wherever we were going, we were nearly there. The forest closed in around us, the trees like skeletal fingers clawing at the night sky. I couldn't let him take me any farther. I had to do something, anything, before it was too late. My hands were shaking as I glanced at the door handle. Locked, of course, they always locked automatically, but the windows, manual cranks, old-fashioned and stubborn. I didn't have a plan. Not really, but the raw animal instinct to survive took over. When I moved, it was like breaking out of a trance. The crank turned stiffly, the window sliding down inch by inch as the cold night air rushed in. He must have heard it, must have sensed the shift in the air because he spoke then, calm and measured. I didn't listen. My body moved on autopilot, my fingers fumbling with the handle, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. The next few seconds were a blur. The door swung open and I tumbled out, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of me. Gravel bit into my palms as I scrambled to my feet, the car's headlights blinding me as I staggered forward. He was shouting now, his voice sharp and angry, but I didn't look back. I ran, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest swallowed me whole, branches whipped at my face, roots snatched at my ankles, but I didn't stop, I didn't dare. Behind me I heard the car door slam, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. He was coming after me, and the thought sent a fresh jolt of terror through my veins. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? The darkness stretched on endlessly, the trees towering above like silent witnesses to my fear. When I finally collapsed, my body spent and shaking, the forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I pressed myself against a tree, every muscle tense, my ears straining for the sound of pursuit. Nothing. Just the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. Eventually I found my way back to civilization, though I don't remember how. The details blur together, a kind stranger, a police station, the questions that felt like daggers. The driver was never found. The app claimed no record of my ride, no trace of the car or the man who drove it. It was as if he'd never existed. But I know the truth. I can still feel the weight of his gaze in the rearview mirror, the calm malice in his silence. And no matter how far I run, I'll never escape the memory of that night or the certainty that he's still out there waiting. The woods always have a way of getting under your skin. It's not just the quiet or the shadows that stretch too long. It's the feeling that something is watching, even when you know you're alone. I'd taken the kids out there for a bit of peace, a weekend to unplug, to escape the hum and buzz of the world. A bonding trip, I called it, something wholesome. A fire, marshmallows, a tent pitched under the stars, just us and nature. We'd parked the car at a gravel lot that led into a marked trailhead, promising views of the valley and a crystal-clear lake. It had all seemed so picturesque in the brochures, the sort of place you'd see in a postcard or a calendar. The kids were less enthusiastic. Ben, 12 years old and sullen, glued to his phone until the battery ran out. Lily, 10 and full of questions about bears, spiders, and every other woodland horror her imagination could conjure. I told them we'd be fine. Stick to the path. Follow the map. Easy. We'd been walking for hours when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Not just the kids, they were trailing behind, too tired to argue, but the forest itself. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the dirt and the distant groan of the wind through the treetops. I told myself it was nothing. Nature has its moods after all. We veered off the trail to find a spot for lunch, something a little more private. That's when we saw them. There were 3 men, maybe 4, standing in a clearing just ahead. They hadn't seen us. We'd been quiet without meaning to be. My first thought was that they were hunters, though they didn't have guns. Instead, they were clustered around a freshly dug hole in the ground. One of them held a shovel. Another was bent over, dragging something wrapped in a thick black tarp toward the pit. The shape inside was too big to be an animal. It didn't hit me all at once, not the way it does in movies. My mind wanted to rationalize it, to make it fit into some harmless explanation. Trash disposal? No. The tarp shifted as the man heaved it into the hole, and I saw the outline of a leg, stiff and unmistakable. I froze, every instinct in me screaming to turn back, to grab the kids and run. But Lily whispered my name, just loud enough for the sound to carry. One of the men snapped his head up. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and dark. He didn't say anything, just stared, his hand clenching around the edge of the shovel. Another man, taller, broader, turned to look as well. There was something deliberate in the way he moved, like a predator sizing up its prey. I grabbed the kids and backed away, trying to be quiet, but Ben stumbled on a root, and the noise echoed through the trees like a gunshot. That was when they started coming toward us. We ran. God, did we run. The woods turned into a labyrinth, the map in my head dissolving into blind panic. The kids were crying, but I didn't have time to comfort them. I could hear the men behind us crashing through the undergrowth. They didn't yell or threaten, they didn't need to. Their silence was worse. a cold certainty that they wouldn't stop until they caught us. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees too close, the paths twisting back on themselves. I tried to keep the kids close, but Lily's hand slipped from mine and I had to stop, turning back to grab her. That's when I saw them, just a few meters away. One of the men, the tall one, standing still between the trees. He wasn't out of breath, he wasn't even sweating. He just looked at me with this blank expression, like he was trying to decide what to do with us. I yanked Lily forward, dragging her as Ben stumbled ahead. The light was fading, the forest growing darker with every step. We stumbled into a stream and followed it, the icy water soaking our shoes and numbing our feet. It was harder to track us that way, I hoped, but the thought didn't bring much comfort. They'd been out here longer than us, they knew these woods. By nightfall, we'd found a small hollow beneath a fallen tree. I told the kids to be quiet, to stay still, but they were shaking, and so was I. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I thought about the hole in the ground, the tarp, the men's faces. I thought about how no one knew we were out here, how far we'd gone off the trail. Sometime in the early hours, I heard footsteps close by, slow, deliberate. They were searching, sweeping through the forest like wolves on a scent. I held the kids close, trying to control my breathing, trying not to let the fear show. The footsteps stopped. A shadow passed over us, blocking the thin strip of moonlight filtering through the trees. I don't know if he saw us or if he decided we weren't worth the effort. Maybe he wanted us to keep running, to wear ourselves down. Either way, he moved on, and we were left in the suffocating silence once more. By morning, we stumbled back onto the trail, battered and bleeding, but alive. The men were gone, or at least we didn't see them again. When we finally found a ranger station, I tried to explain what had happened, but the look on the ranger's face told me everything I needed to know. He didn't believe me, or maybe he did, and that was worse. We never found out who they were or what they'd buried. The police searched, or so they said, but nothing came of it. The woods swallowed the truth, just like they'd swallowed us. The woods always have a way of getting under your skin.